Comes to us from the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art in Norman, Oklahoma. So,
I'm going to read Heather's bio, and then I also wanted to let you know that after Heather's talk, we'll be walking over to the exhibition for a gallery walkthrough with the co-curators, Marwin Begay and John Hitchcock. So please join us following Heather's presentation over at the exhibition space, and they'll be talking about contemporary Native art. One second. There's no stapler for this one.
Starts right here.
Can I help that? It's the first time we've done this. All right, so I want to introduce Heather Ahtone. She is currently the James T. Ballack Assistant Curator of Native American and Non-Western Art at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. The primary focus of Heather's research and writing has been to examine how contemporary indigenous art intersects tribal cultures and traditional knowledge. This has included curating contemporary art exhibitions, serving as instructor for classes on Native science and art history, and researching the evolution of tribal design usage of materials. Heather is developing an interdisciplinary approach to analyzing indigenous art that integrates tribes' place-based knowledge of the environment and how this is incorporated within their cosmology and interpreted into designs and art production. She is committed to supporting the local Oklahoma art and tribal communities. She is a member of the Chickasaw Nation and has strong family ties to the Choctaw and Kiowa communities. Please help me to welcome Heather.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much, and thank you, Julie, for having me here. And I appreciate each of you for coming today. And I see my colleague, Edgar Keeper-Bird, has just arrived, and it's nice to see you here. I don't see him very often, actually, in Norman, even though we're on the same campus. And I'm also very honored to speak with Nita and Harriet Miflo, who are here, too. I usually get really nervous, so I'm going to work on that. So, I'm not one of the curators for this show, although generally that's my profession. I'm not one of the artists. So what can I possibly add to today's conversation? What I've been doing for the last 8 years has been looking at Native art and trying to help people who are maybe not familiar with the iconography that's represented within the imagery to better connect with it. And so my hope is I've picked out 3 works to discuss with you today. And I'm hoping that there's a couple of things you should know. First of all, I am not speaking on behalf of any of the artists who are here. So they can speak on their own behalf, and if you have questions, I encourage you to engage in a conversation with them because they're incredibly eloquent people. Secondly, those artists with whom I've selected work, I actually corresponded with them. And so my conversation with you about this work is not simply my own analysis, but certainly I consider my methodology necessarily collaborative with the artists. I don't like to say something that they feel is a misjudgment or a misapplication of a reading. However, many of the artists have expressed to me that having somebody come and look at it from outside their brain sometimes helps them to see things that they didn't intend to do, but that they're very happy that they did. And I think that's part of what an artist's role is versus what maybe an art historian or art curator can do to work, is to help bridge the beautiful creation that somebody has made to speak to people in a very human and emotional manner, because it's when we have those emotional responses to work that even if we didn't make it, we find that connection. So I've selected a couple of pieces, and I'm going to tell you this. I first of all just arrived just a couple of hours ago, so if I feel scattered, it's just because part of my brain is still in New York. But I just saw the show for the first time, And if you haven't had a chance to see the show, I really encourage you, after my presentation, which will take about 40, 45 minutes, to please join the curators to go through, because they've worked with these artists and had conversations with them, and they're going to be able to expand far beyond what I can give to you in just a few pieces. But I've selected 3 works that they're incredibly emotional. This is a very that's what you get for sitting in the front row. You're making me cry. You better move to the back row. This project, people who are not maybe part of the community that this relates to, this just could be seen as just historical, or some disconnected past from which you may not have a direct tie or a direct understanding. For those of us in Oklahoma, and certainly those of us who have family members, myself included, who were some of these prisoners, this is an incredibly lived part of our experience. So I'm going to talk about just a few pieces, and I suppose what I should do is just get started so I can quit thinking about it and just start talking. The first one that I wanted to discuss is by Norman Akers. He is an Osage artist from, seems like right outside Pawhuska in Oklahoma, which is up on the northern Kansas border. The Osage community is a very rich, like many of our 39 tribes that are in Oklahoma, very dynamic. There are still practices going on that you might think are historical, and yet we live that history. It's part of who we are. And he is very active within his community. He is also a professor of art at the University of Kansas. So like many of us, we do multiple things in addition to being Native. And Norman is an incredibly gifted painter and printmaker, and he prepared this piece called Whiteout. It's dated 2013, so he made it a year ago, but he did make it for this exhibition. I believe all the work in the exhibition was made for this exhibition, which is really important for you to know. And some of the things that he's doing in this work, I wanted to just kind of go through and talk about. So, for instance, he has taken one photograph. And, Nancy, I'm really sorry because I should have checked with you how much you spoke about this image, but if not, I want to spend just a little bit about what he's doing. So Norman is, as I mentioned, a printmaker and a painter, and in this work, he's doing a couple of things that are incredibly referential. So you can see the scale of the image is actually very much driven by the ledger art format, which tends to be the pages of a ledger book. So that's not a mysterious term. Ledger art comes from the fact that these artists were given ledgers, like bank ledgers, and they were, oftentimes these bank ledgers had already been used, sometimes not, but that they would use that basic paper as a material. And one of the things that Norman has done is he has taken one particular photograph, and I'm going to come back to this photograph, but I think it's important to know that the photograph that he has used is of a group of Chiricahua Apache children. And it's important to know that those Chiricahua Apache children were part of a large group of Apache people who were taken from Oklahoma at the end of the Apache Wars and brought to Fort Marion. This particular photograph at the bottom right is actually taken in November 1886, and this grouping in the bottom right is actually a collective grouping of the first group of the Apaches that were brought. And so it's important to see that these children are excerpted outside of that, and it's an important part of the history of what happened at Fort Marion through the oversight of the military to literally remove families, separate families. They would separate the mothers and the children from the warriors. I'm not going to speak to why, because I don't understand why that would have happened, but it was the practice of it. But I wanted you to understand that these children were part of a larger group. Norman works as largely has been referred to in the scholarship on him as a cartographer of sorts. And so what I wanted to share with you here is he is using obviously a section of a map as the background image upon which he's building his layers. but I thought for the historical references, it'd be helpful to provide to you some imagery of the expansion of the railroad to understand this historical experience of these people. So you can see in the upper right corner, this is a map of the U.S. rail expansion that happened between 1815 and 1860. And then in the bottom left corner, you can see the U.S. rail expansion literally just 20, 30 years later. So the experience of these Native warriors and families being brought from Oklahoma could not have happened any sooner than it did because the railroads didn't exist. I also thought it was really interesting. I'll be perfectly honest, I wasn't trying to pick a fight with anybody, but if you can see the map on the bottom left, you see that none of those rail routes actually come to St. Augustine. They actually stop over, I think that was, is it Jacksonville? So the railroads actually stopped there, and it was in 1885 that Flagler came and extended that rail line to this very location, to this area, in order to build what he foresaw as a need for, I don't know, a certain kind of lifestyle. And he wanted to make it easy for the travelers coming from the Northeast to come down to the coast. And so Mr. Flagler was actually responsible for extending that train line from Jacksonville here. And so he actually did that in 1885. So there's a great responsibility, I think, and it's interesting to me that we're having this conversation here at Flagler when he is this gentleman who clearly, his college is lovely and it's wonderful, but it's important to know the historical role that each of us and these places play in this progress that these Native people made here to the coast. So I also wanted to speak to why would Norman Akers be so interested in cartography? And one of the things that Norman and I have spoken about quite often, and I'm actually working on some research and a paper on him, is his use of cartography is actually born out of a very long tradition of cartography within various Native communities. So a lot of times, okay, so maps, and we think of maps, and we think of them in very much the way that you see in the bottom left corner, right? You've got a geographic space, and you have these like assertions of borders and travel routes and all those kinds of things, and this is how we understand maps. But maps have been present in this continent for at least 500 years, and actually my contention would be that they would be long past that. But the use of maps within the continent here was more of a relationships of power, certainly economic exchange, and also hunting boundaries and respect for other communities. So, for instance, there are, Emily mentioned that I have the Chickasaw. There's a Chickasaw map that is dated back to 1517 that was taken from, it was made by a Chickasaw person and drawn on hide and taken back to Spain, actually, and it was an organization of circles. And the bigger the circle meant the greater the alliance was. It didn't have anything to do with population, like now we think of larger circles, and that's evidence of a larger city, right? Like you see a bigger city, then that means that's a bigger city. But these were reflective of the economic exchange and the alliance that existed between these communities. And so, for instance, and I haven't brought it in, and here I am talking about it, so I apologize for that, but these circles were a way of creating relationships, and a series of circles bound to each other with lines meant these were the various allies. And because these communities could be quite disparate in distance from each other, those alliances were critical, because if you were trying to defend anybody with whom you had some kind of economic and political alliance, actually is someone who had a group of people within a village who had committed themselves that if you came under attack, they would consider it an attack against themselves. And so these alliances were critical to survival and maintenance of the boundaries between communities. And it wasn't so much a power struggle over space, although always geography is somehow an underlying component of that, but it was important in order to understand the trade routes, which literally permeated across the continent, both east and west and north and south. There are materials that are found in the northern plains, which are only found in central Mexico, because these trade routes have existed for so long. And so the use of maps has a very long history. I did provide to you, though, this is a painting on the right. It is by Norman Akers. This is called Okisa II. And Okisa just means, the way home or home. And you can see here that he's drawn a relationship between this elk, the landscape that serves as the background, and the road maps and the boundaries of the various counties there that go across, and you can see the relationship between those counties and the Osage Indian Reservation, which is the only Indian reservation in Oklahoma. One of the reasons that cartography is important to Norman is that in traditional Osage, cartography actually uses the physical body of the elk as a way of reflecting the relationship between the earth, the land, and the people. And so if you look at the way that the back of the elk sort of circumnavigates, do you see that it's also reflected in that local landscape? So the places where the Osage people saw as their homes have that sort of rolling hills, they have the wide open expanses, and that's reflected in the physiography of the elk itself. The Osage people also believe that the antlers are a physical embodiment of the river systems. And so these kinds of references between the antlers, the back of the elk, and you see here he's laid those over the landscape with the bodies of water there, and then conflating that with a map that people recognize for him as a commentary on how does one find one's way home. Is it just about the maps? Is it just about the roads that get you there? Or is it also that relationship that you have between the traditional knowledge of being home and having that place to enact that knowledge? And so those things are important because we have to understand that these children, these Apache children, were certainly taken out of the context of what was their home. There's no way that you can imagine that in any other way. They were taken not only from their homelands, which were not really even in Oklahoma, but they had been maneuvered into Oklahoma. Does that seem like a fair way, Nancy, to describe that? I don't They've been maneuvered into Oklahoma and then, surrendered, which is just, I don't know how to describe that history, and it's not really my place to speak to that, but then brought to Florida and then further removed from their families. And with that, we can look at these two photographs as a comparison. And so you have this image that is referenced in Norman's specific piece, which is the one on the upper right, and that's the original image that was taken by, let me see, I have his name. It was a photograph by John Choate, and I saw in the exhibition, you guys didn't have a source, but that I located it in the National Museum of the American Indians Archives, and so we can, if you wanted to, you could add that. The photograph itself was owned by Colonel Nelson Miles, and then it was gifted to the Smithsonian, which eventually opened the National Museum, and so that's where the original film sits. One of the things that's I guess problematic for me is that we often see these photographs of historical images. And how many of you, how many of you feel like even if you've not seen this specific image, you've seen images like it? And how many times have you looked at that image and at least wondered who they were? A little bit kind of wondered. So for this moment, I just wanted to share with you, these are real people and I have their names. So I'm going to read their names just to honor them in this moment. And I hope I won't get choked up on it, but that's it. And who knows, I'm going to apologize to the people here because I'm probably going to really butcher the names. But so I'm reading the front row, left to right, is Clement Sinelze, Beatrice Kietel, Jeanette Pagastatum, Margaret Nadash, Margaret Nadashtila, Frederick Eskel Seger. Middle row is Humphrey Eseharze, Samson Noren, Basil Icardin, and the back row is Hugh Chi, Bishop Etana, and Ernest Hoagie. Those are the names that are provided with the National Museum, and I think it's important to just recognize that these were, real people, not just some abstracted historical reference that is being made. And I also, again, apologize because I'm sure I probably really butchered up those names. But when we think about these children, so there are two images of the same group. The first image is the one on the top. This is taken at Fort Marion right before their removal to Carlisle Indian School. And then the second photograph is taken actually months after their removal at Carlisle. There are two things that are really important to think about when we look at these historic photographs. One is that if you look at the first image, do you see how starved these children are? I mean, they're incredibly thin. They are bedraggled. I will tell you, as growing up in a Native family, there is nothing more important to a mother than making sure that her children are well taken care of and loved and provided for. So there is no doubt in my mind that the families that were bringing these children as prisoners, it was under duress. No matter how you can imagine whatever the negotiation had happened to bring them here, that these mothers and these fathers, that this was something that they would have done any better way if it would have kept their children alive. I think that's often overlooked. The second thing is that when you look in the second photograph, when they're at Carlisle, one of the things you'll notice is that, first of all, they're a little plumper. My guess is that they were plumped up specifically for this photograph. I've heard from many families, and if you look at some of the photographs of the children when they're taken in large groups, they are not so plump. But I think that this was planned, that there was an expectation that this was going to be used to promote Carlisle as part of federal policy and the intentions of the government to, what is Colonel Pratt's? I don't want to use it too early, but he does say, kill the Indian, save the man. And that was the intention of this, and it's important to understand that that was intentionally done within this image. Secondly, it was a common practice at this time, and we have extensive photographs of the Oklahoma Historical Society that I comb through whenever I have the opportunity, where the photographers at this time were taking pictures of Native people, and often when they were in these, I guess, I don't know how you would describe it any differently, but the white man's clothes, right? Like they've been cleaned up, they've been put in proper, cloth dresses with the buttons tied up. The other thing that you'll notice is that the skin color of the children has been bleached. And this was very common because it was a way of showing that assimilation physically and tangibly through these photographs. These are the same children. They would not have had such, you would have to keep them in a cave to get them to lose their skin tone. Truly, these children at Carlisle, the stories of them being there is that they were hardworking, they were not allowed to stay indoors and rest. These are important things to understand in the use of these photographs. And I think it's important to understand that Norman has made a choice about which of these images to look at. Which of these images represents those children? And then finally, his use of the whiteout, which I don't, this is harder and harder to find. I actually had to have our administrative assistant at the museum go to some great depths to find whiteout, because I still use it periodically, not often, of course, because anytime now, if you want to change something on a document, you simply repost it up in the Word or the computer, right, and then you reprint it with the corrections made. But there's sort of two sides of the coin, one might say, with how Norman has used the whiteout. I think it's important to understand that he is, in his artist statement, I think he asserts that the whiteout is an erasure. And so I would challenge you to think of it as perhaps two forms of erasure. One is the way that it erases, that the children might hope that the whiteout could erase the imperialist expansion of the American government across the continent. That it's their desire to go home, and it's very difficult to see in the image, but there are heartstrings. There's little hearts drawn on each of the children, and there's a line that's actually connecting them to the far west of the image, because they are connecting he's connecting the children to their original homeland, which is not even in Oklahoma. So he's even passing back to that original place. The second thing, though, I think that you have to think about is that this whole southeastern seaboard was filled with Native people. And, it doesn't matter how much education you've got, all you've got to do is, I just, spent 3 days in New York, you don't see very many Indian people. And so it's part of the whiteout is also just the erasure of that Native presence. Very often, some of the only presence left of Native people in this region is through the names that are still attached to these places. And so I think it's important to understand that he did leave some of those names actually exposed, and when you go next door and get to see it, you can see that there's he's playing with that, what's visible, what's not visible. And I think that's a very clever means of engaging people with this idea of map and place and belonging. I'm going to move on to the next image. So this one is, gosh, if you look at this, I don't know how many of you have seen this. I'm glad so many of you have had a chance to go next door. One of the things about it is, of all the images, there's a certain simplicity to it. Because many of the images in this exhibition are complex because this is a very complex history. But there's a simplicity to what Diani did that I think needs a little elaboration. And she was really happy when I contacted her and said, I want to talk about your piece, and this is the things that I'm reading into it. And she said, thank God, because I could only put 150 words into the artist statement, because there's challenges, right? The curators have to make choices. I make these difficult choices every day. But there was so much in this image, and she just really wanted to share that. And so I wanted to bring that in. I'm going to add some of my own interpretation to it. So her piece is called The Business of Killing an Indian. Diani is Sikanju Lakota. And what it is there are 73 hearts here, and each of them has been pierced. The hearts were, basically the hearts are the negative space of the ledger paper. And so what you have here is each little heart has been pierced by a porcupine quill. And so the porcupine quill, you might go, well, what's that? I mean, maybe here in Florida that's not very common. I don't really know actually how common it is to find quill work here, but in the plains it's a very old and traditioned practice of decorating surfaces. And in fact, for the Lakota people, they have a belief that there is a story attached to how the Lakota people came to have quill work as a design method or medium. And the story related to it, I'm not going to go into it because we really don't have time, but it is important to understand that the quill work, the use of quills and the practice of using them as a decorative medium has sacred attachments to it. And so through their beliefs, these quills are worked, they're maneuvered, and I provided to you an image here in the lower right of a pipe bag that has a medallion made out of quills so that you can see how they work together, and so that they don't look, they're not quite as exposed as what Diani has done in the piece for this project, but I wanted you to see how traditionally how they would have been used as a decorative surface. And the way that these quills were collected, I think it's interesting to understand. The way that quills were traditionally collected is that the women would come upon a porcupine. They would be out intentionally looking, so it wasn't like accidental or whatever. But they would come upon the porcupine, and they would actually throw a blanket over it. And what is the defense of a porcupine is the quills go up, and what they would do then is they would pull the blanket off. And with the blanket coming off, the quills would detach from the porcupine. And so in that way, it didn't actually harm the porcupine. They can regrow them. And so it's a way for them to continue to, it's harvesting them without damaging the porcupine itself. And so anyway, I just thought that that would be very important for you to understand that these porcupines, it's part of traditional Lakota use. And she is, of course, working with the ledger paper, and I wanted to show you an image here. And it wasn't relevant so much with what Norman did, but here it's very relevant. When you go and you look at the original surface of it, you can still see the exposed writing, and you can see through these hearts, like that relationship back to the ledger paper. And so it's important to keep in mind that she is thinking very specifically of this. But it's not for somebody who's Lakota, in that it is not so disconnected from this, because many people think of ledger art as really starting here at Fort Marion. And I think the truth is, and I've had long conversations actually about this with Joe Horsecapture. He and I are slated to write an article for the fall issue of First American Art addressing ledger art, because even though ledger art is seen as having its birthplace here, it's largely the market for ledger art that really gets started here in Fort Marion, because these artists were given, the prisoners were given the ledgers, encouraged to use crayons and colored pencils to make these images. they were documenting for themselves the experiences that they were having. There are some great images, there's great examples of it next door. And some of the images that I can recall for you that I have seen are images of the Indians dressed in soldiers' clothing and dancing with the women, because they actually could make extra money. The socialites would come and they would have evenings where they could come and dance with the native people. And I'm sorry, it's funny to me, it's kind of ridiculous, and it's also really important to understand that relationship between the market of native art and the way that those things have been integrated with that sort of expansion of, I guess, the idea of elitism and things like that. I mean, that's a really important thing to think about, how native art has come to have the market that it is, and to some extent I think that's still a part, although maybe not as much as it formerly was. I also wanted to show you though, because for Diani this piece is really about the relationship of Colonel Pratt to the native people. And so that relationship gets founded here at Fort Marion through these 73 warriors, but also, as I mentioned, through Norman's work, the children who were then taken from Fort Marion up to Carlisle. He was Captain Pratt here, he becomes Colonel Pratt, goes up and establishes Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And so there's a relationship between the photograph above and the top right, which is, and this is something that's interesting to me. There's often this number of 73 warriors who were brought. But there was at one point, and I'm sorry, I had it in my notes somewhere, but I couldn't quite find it, but there were as many, I believe, as 600 native people here at one time. When you had all of the Plains warriors and the Apache people here. And to me, when I drove by the fort today, it took my breath away. That's a lot of people to have compressed into such a small area. And I don't know all the dynamics of that, so I don't want to go into it, but I think there are records of this, hundreds of Indians here that were completely transplanted into this space. And so really, it really is the beginning of that relationship that Colonel Pratt has, where, and in the top right image, what you see are 53 warriors. I went through several archives trying to find an image that at least showed all 73. So a little bit I'm playing with the numbers because Diani has done an image with 73 hearts, and I thought it'd be really interesting to have a comparison of the relationship between the actual people that are represented. But this image was the only image that I could find, and they were not even then all represented here at Fort Marion. So you have these moments of these groupings, and there are some really interesting archival images of the native men in that transition, pre-civilization, post-civilization comparisons, not unlike what we saw with the children. But you don't get to see the whole of them, and I really wondered about that because I thought, well, I've already explained that this photography, this is a very politicized body of photography. And it occurred to me that perhaps they didn't, and this is just conjecture on my part, but it occurred to me that perhaps they really didn't want to show so many warriors all at once. Perhaps that would be frightening, and perhaps there would be a sense that they could rise up, right? Even as native people in these soldiers' clothing, as you can see all the top image, they're all in soldiers' clothing, that perhaps that might still be fearful. But it clearly is not an issue when you go to Carlisle, where they've taken thousands of children. And you can see in this image, these children, and this particular image is, let me see if I can find my notes on it. I have a specific date for that image. I'm sorry, I can't find the date that I made for that, but the image with the, I'm going to try one more place.
Yeah, some of them sit in
Yeah, I don't have a date for it. But that image from Carlisle is one that was done repeatedly. They would annually take photographs of the children at Carlisle, and they would always come out in these very pressed uniforms and present them. I have a dear friend, Shan Goswarn, who has a photograph of one of her baskets as part of the exhibition. And the photograph that she has in the exhibition is of a basket that she did, which was actually a casket, a child-sized casket, with multiple images of these children from Carlisle. The exterior of the basket is this image or a similar image of the children from Carlisle interwoven with the text of Colonel Pratt's "Kill the Indian, Save the Man" speech, which becomes a real seminal moment in the turning of the expansion to assimilate Indian people. And one of the things that's very interesting to me that Shan mentioned that I wanted to share with you is that whenever you look at these images of all the children, Colonel Pratt is always in that image. He's never with the children. He doesn't want to be aligned with the children. He doesn't want to be grouped with them because his intention is not actually to care about those children. He is always in the background, and you look, and there's a couple of images in the flat case of the children, and I was able to find them walking through. I was able to find him because when he is at Carlisle, he grows a very long beard, and he is and it's white, so it's very distinctive, and he is almost always standing in the background. And some of the stories that Shan, when she was going through her research, and she shared, addressed the fact that there was in the Carlisle has an arrangement, and you can see here of these rooms. These are dormitories here in the background, and the dormitories form sort of a U shape or a square or rectangular shape. And in the middle of Carlisle is a gazebo. And when she was doing the research, Colonel Pratt was often just seen standing in the gazebo. These children would tell their families about it in the letters that they would see Colonel Pratt in the gazebo. He was always watching them. He was always observing them. And I don't want to imply that he cared about these children, because I think that would be a mistake. I think he cared about what he thought was the best thing for the United States, and what was the best thing for how would they look if they just killed all these Indians. I think at this time things have started to shift in the politics, and I think there's not this potential to continue to just exterminate tribes and communities as had been done for over 100, 200 years at that point. And so I think there's this idea that he's looking at how can we make them us. And so his watching was observation, and one can't help but also think of it as a little bit Big Brotherish, and not Big Brotherish in a caring manner, but more George Orwellian. The other thing that Diani wanted to talk about was that when she thinks of Colonel Pratt, she thinks of the long-term implications of the policies that he set in motion. And I included in the bottom left corner a photograph of the cemetery at Carlisle. Not to be grim or morose, but truly these are the children who didn't make it home. And the vast majority of these children did eventually go back to their homes. But who they went back as is something that I think our tribal communities are still dealing with, that historic trauma that continues generation after generation because of the unspokenness of it, because of the silence of it. And I think that's one of the things that I find very compelling of what Diani has done. She speaks to how could a single person have such a significant impact on so many families, long-lasting for generations. There are very few people in our American history that we can all look back to and say, oh yeah, I feel like they had an impact on me. But I can tell you that my great-grandfather was one of those children who went to Carlisle. And him coming back, when he returned, he also became a deacon of one of the first churches in our community, the Rainy Mountain Church. And so there's this history of not only going, but also then the process of Christianization, and then the process of recovery, which I think there are still, in our Rainy Mountain Church is currently really struggling with recovery from that. There's a lot of families that have started shifting either just away from church altogether or not returning at all because it's too painful. And it's a lived part of our memory, and I wanted to mention that. I have one other image to talk about, but it's short. Do you think I have time to talk about one other image? Okay. So, and there's one more thing I wanted to mention about Diani's before I move on. When I was visiting with Diani, there was a matter of the way that the quills are piercing the paper that resembled to me something that is done in the Lakota community as one of their ritual practices, that is a ritual practice of healing, and it's a part of their way of making things right, of bringing things back into order. And without going into the details of the ceremony or the ritual, I thought it was really evident to me that that was something she had intended. When I asked her about that, she said, no, but it's right. It's right that you see that, and let people know that we are human. So the final one I wanted to mention is by Bobby Martin. He's one of our Oklahoma artists, and so I got to kind of bring it home a little bit too. Bobby is Muskogee Creek. He's a professor at John Brown University, which is in Arkansas, but he lives in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and commutes. It's really not that far to the eastern or the western border of Arkansas. And his piece is Pursuit of Civilization number 5. And his is a little bit lighter, but also very interesting, and so I'll go through this very quickly. He did not have a family relationship to the Fort Marion prisoners, but the history to him was very interesting. And so he did some research on the different people that were included. He looked at lots of different evidence of the ledger art. And one of the ones that he found very interesting was this gentleman. His name is Koba, and he was one of Colonel Pratt's star pupils. And so what Bobby did was he actually took the writing done by Koba as his ledger art. And so what Bobby did was he took this, and it's actually, I've provided to you an image of the original text on the right, and that it was actually a letter to his father. And it's showing his father how he's gaining these skills of communicating through the written English language. And so Bobby is using that letter to his father, Koba's father, as his ledger paper. And he's overlaying it with this image that he found in his maternal grandmother's things. So his maternal grandmother went to Dwight Mission, which is one of the missions in Oklahoma, which was founded on the same practices of Colonel Pratt's Carlisle Academy. And so his grandmother had gone to Dwight Mission, and when she passed away, they were going through her things and they found this photograph. And so he sent me the original photograph so I could share it with you, and it's just titled Mystery Man. And so it's really interesting because they wondered, who is this guy that his grandmother never gave the photo away, right? Like, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I only have just a couple of photographs that are not my husband. And I don't need to tell him that. But so who is this guy? And so he just thought it was very interesting because kind of in the same way that I mentioned those historic images, that these they're anonymous, and that anonymity is part of the invisibility of the Native experience. This man truly, nobody in the family who actually owns this original photograph knows who he is, but he stands in for all those anonymous and unnamed people throughout history, to which his grandmother had such a close relationship, whatever it would be, and I don't want to make any undue speculation, but that she thought enough of this person and whatever their relationship was to hold on to his photograph. And so I'm going to end there, and I think there's just a couple of minutes for questions, or you may not have questions. It's okay if you don't have to have questions. But certainly I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate you all being patient and lively, nodding along.
Are there questions for Heather? Yes, one in the back.
You were talking about in the photograph how they would bleach the skin of the children.
In the photographic process.
Okay, so it wasn't like makeup or something like the children, but it was just as a part of the development of the photograph, they would take care to do that. Okay.
Yes.
Can you talk about why they were given the ledgers? What was the purpose of giving the ledgers? Is there a specific purpose, or?
I don't know if I'm I'm the right person to answer that. So I'm going to repeat her question, maybe somebody else can help out. So she's asking the question, why were they given the ledgers as artistic material, or?
Was that a request, or was that just?
I can speak to that. And were you able to see any of the ledgers next door? You'll get a sense of the scale. So there are many different sizes of the ledgers, and Heather was speaking to that, like where you have the railroad ledgers, which are very long, or you have in different kinds of industry ledger books. And Colonel Pratt gave this specific size of, it's like 9 inches by 11. It's very close to our letter size, our contemporary letter size. And he was interested in having the men record their experience on the train ride from Oklahoma to Florida, as well as remembering their traditions. And there's sort of this careful line that I think we're all walking as a viewer, as a maker, as a historian of him giving the ledger drawings and asking for these writings and asking for these pages as a way to promote his re-education. And this sort of exoticism of selling the ledger pages to the community, and specifically to St. Augustine. They were being trained, this was one of the possible jobs, was to sell these ledger drawings, and this is this is new information to me about the dancing. But also bow and arrows were sold in this community. And there is an original arrow on display in the park system that's on A1A. I can find that for you if you'd like to see it. I'm trying to think. And Marlon is going to speak more about the history and the impact of the ledger drawings on artists, because it becomes a forum and a whole area of art and contemporary art.
Thank you. I was just concerned because they were given for a purpose. They weren't asked to have.
They were given the ledger book, and there is still an actual ledger book that Pratt owns. He gave it to his family. It's now divided. One half of the book exists at Dickinson College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, right by the Carlisle Indian School. The other half of the ledger book is in the Benincke Library at Yale. So yes, he had a very specific agenda, whether it was just keeping track of, and this kind of interest in keeping track of what was happening in this transition. At the beginning of the ledger book, he has a photograph of the prisoners as they arrive. So very similar to what you saw with the children. They look emaciated, exhausted. And then at the end of the ledger book, he has the reformed image where they're in Western clothes, their hair is cut, and they're moving into a different world and a different life. And it's hard not to sort of understand the gravity of that beginning and end, this bookend, and then the ledger drawings in between that were done by a Kiowa leader who ends up making these ledgers from this area very famous. And just to speak to what Heather was saying, I mean, it is so emotional. And all of us are coming to, this is academic in a way. We're having to talk about it academically. And Heather, I love how you opened up specific artworks and aligned it with the history. It's wonderful to see that directness. And then at times it's hard not to be completely overwhelmed by the emotion of this, especially when you see that 10,000 children came through Carlisle Indian School, and that the first class of the Carlisle School was 72 children, to mirror the 72 that were here in St. Augustine. And then you have 10 years later, you have 530 Chiricahua Apache men, women, and children. So this is what Heather is saying about the hundreds. So it is hard not to sometimes just be overwhelmed by the emotion of it and the humanitarian. Yes, Ed.
I wanted to add, thinking about the ledgers, but Robert Miller Gallery brokered the whole book on 57th Street in New York City and took half the money. I was out at the show, and this was like 1989 or So these books that were made as prisoners of war, the collectors brokered them in New York City and made thousands of dollars just a few years ago. So they're actually being sold on the black market, and they're being used by people today, nothing to do with their families or anything, but they're brokered by like art gallery articles.
Yes.
How long was the Carlisle Indian School open? I mean, how long was it?
Into the 1930s, I believe. Is that correct? We have to get back to you on that. Where's the question? Will you ask us that at the break? We can search that out for you. So we had a morning panel, and it was a really rich exchange of personal family stories with Juanita Patapony and Harry Mithelo and Nancy Mithelo that are in the back row here. And Harry and Nancy are a direct descendant of Watson Mithelo that was here. This is Harry's father and Nancy's grandfather. Also on the panel, and for tonight at 7 o'clock, we have Edgar Heapabirds, who is also a descendant of Heapabirds that was here, and I'll let you speak directly to that, Edgar. I'm looking forward to hearing that. And also at 7, we'll have Willie Johns from the Seminole Tribe of Florida speaking to us. We're really guests here on your land here, Willie. So Heather, thank you so much for that. That's awesome. So, yeah. Before we walk next door, I'd like to read to you the bios of Marwan Begay and John Hitchcock. Marwan Begay is the co-curator of Rewriting History. He is an assistant professor of art at the University of Oklahoma. Begay received his MFA from the University of Oklahoma in 2006. As an artist and as a member of the Navajo Nation, his research has concentrated on the issues of cultural identity, especially the intersection of traditional American Indian culture and pop culture. His work has been exhibited nationally through the US and internationally in New Zealand, Argentina, Paraguay, and Estonia. He has received numerous awards, including the Oklahoma Visual Artists Coalition, Visual Arts Fellowship, and Red Earth in 2009. Yeah, I know. And then, also speaking next door will be John Hitchcock, co-curator of Rewriting History. It's been so much fun to work with these two men. I mean, this is co-curator of Rewriting History. John Hitchcock received his MFA from Texas Tech University in 1997. He is currently a professor of art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His most recent exhibitions have been at the American Culture Center in Shanghai, China, the North Dakota Museum of Art in Grand Forks, and the University of Ca' Foscari in Venice, Italy. His work is shown extensively and is found in public and private collections through the United States and abroad. So please join us next door with John and Marwan for a walk through the gallery.